73% of boomer males. No matter what psychological challenges I face, I will not let them define me. 72% of Gen Z females. Mental illness is an important part of my identity.
This chart right here that we're looking at is absolutely shocking to me. What it's looking at is, quote, mental health challenges are an important part of my identity, end quote. And then it's looking at how this has changed over time, where if you look at males who are boomers, only 27% would say that mental health challenges are an important part of their identity. Whereas if you look at Gen Z females, a full 72% say mental illness is an important part of my identity. Now, I
Wow.
want to point out here, not even 72% of the population has a mental illness or a real mental illness, I guess I should say. And yet, 72% of young women are identifying with a mental illness as an important aspect of who they are.
That
And I
is
really wanted to, one,
crazy.
dive deep on the negative psychological effects of this to an individual, why this is a really dangerous thing that this is happening, how this comes downstream from the destruction of our religious systems and understanding. Because I think for a lot of people, as they destroyed and eroded the concept of a soul, they needed something to replace it,
Mm.
something that described who they were
Mhm.
and that they could identify with in sort of a deeper sense. And I think for many people that became either gender or a mental illness, or gender and a mental illness,
Well,
or a
or you
gender
could
that is
say
a mental illness.
intersectional, identity and victimhood as well.
Yes, and for people who are like, "Well, how bad is it for males?" 67% of males in Gen Z identify with a mental illness as a major part of their personality. If you were looking at millennials, it's 67% of women, so the same as Gen Z males, and for males, 56%. Now, this is interesting to me. Even if you're talking about millennial males, over half of them identify with a mental illness as being a primary part of their identity.
That checks
Um,
out given the younger people that we've spoken with and people in our own generation.
Yeah, and where was the big jump here? Well, the big jump started with Gen X, so our generation, where
No,
a
no, no,
full
just above our generation is Gen X. We're millennials, and then below us is
oh, Gen X is above us.
yeah, Gen X is so we have the greatest generation. These are the
Mhm.
people who fought in World War II. The lost generation. This is the generation that was too young to fight in World War II in the United States. Then we have the boomers who were the children of the World War II war heroes. Then we have Gen X, which came after the boomers. Then we have millennials. Then we have um,
Okay, well, then in our older generation, there was a big jump from boomers to Gen X, where it went from, in boomers, 27% of males to 47% of male Gen X.
mm,
And then for boomer females, it was 34% to 53% of female Gen X. So already within women of our generation, you're seeing this set. And I would put all of this within the caveat of, Simone, you are autistic. You've been diagnosed with autism much, much later in life, not as a young person. What basically happened is we took one of our sons in to get diagnosed. They were like, oh, here is why he's autistic. And then Simone was like, those aren't autism symptoms. Those are all normal things. And then they're like, have you ever been tested for autism? And then they tested you and you were like, oh, I guess I am. And before autism, you thought you had OCD.
I had
But
been clinically diagnosed with OCD.
but did you ever make the OCD or autism diagnoses a major part of your identity? Like, would you have
No.
answered mental illness is an important part of my identity?
No, and I tried to hide it, as you know.
Mhm. And okay, so first I want to talk about, I think, partially why this is happening. And
Mhm,
this comes from something that I noticed. We have another episode where we go over this, like the turning of gender into a concept of a soul,
mhm.
where especially when you have these huge ranges of genders that you can identify with, and when you talk to somebody about this, you're like, well, what is this thing that you're calling gender? Because clearly it's not like what I mean when I think gender. I'm like, do they have a penis? Like, that's what I'm asking when I say gender, right? They mean something else when they say gender. And they're like, well, it's like the way you relate to reality. It's the way you see yourself. And I'm like,
Mhm.
oh, so it's like your genetic, like sociological profile, right? Like you mean, and they're like, oh, no, 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 no. It's not
Yeah,
genetic.
not that.
You can't be, yeah, because then the people who, then you become what they call a true scum is the term. This means that you can only consider yourself trans, i.e. choose your gender, if you have a form of dysphoria. And if you
Mm.
don't have a form of dysphoria, they basically see it as like a form of gatekeeping. And the anti-true scum movement has largely won, which means anyone can identify whatever you want. So they're like, oh, it's not genetic. And then I'm like, oh, so it's like your personal preference. And they're like, whoa, 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 whoa. It's not a preference either. Okay. That's a very offensive thing to say. And I go, okay, so it's not a preference, but it's not like genetic. And it's not something that I can like put my finger on. And it's like core to how you self identify. You've like reinvented the soul, but like gendered it.
Exactly.
And I think that mental health issues for people who aren't fortunate enough to be able to decide, and when I say fortunate enough, I mean this with, within this generational context where this is like sort of an elite class that gets access to special privileges.
And I would say that having a formal mental health diagnosis is a product of privilege because the amount of money you have to pay to get one is quite high. We spend a lot of money just to get an autism diagnosis for our sons and
Yeah, but
also
I'm
for
sure you could
me.
do it through state services.
No, because we tried to do that
I
first.
would actually go so far as to say that the mental health diagnoses these days are a form of a separate type of privilege, which is,
Mm,
yes, it might be a monetary privilege, but I think that the bigger privilege is having a mental illness at all within this new cultural context equates you as higher status than people who don't have mental illnesses. And I think that that is partially why individuals have chosen to identify with them. And if you say, well, what do you mean by higher status? I would say that you have the ability to shut down other people's one criticism of you within certain areas. You can
right.
say, well, I'm autistic. You don't get to say I'm not allowed to act this way. So basically, if you look historically, like if I go to like court culture or something like that,
Mm,
status was largely like, what are the things that I'm allowed to do that other people aren't allowed to do? I am
yeah, no, very true. Yeah, pulling rank.
pulling rank, yes, and
Mhm.
it gives you the ability to pull rank. It gives you the ability to do things that are, like, socially shunned by other people.
Right.
It gives you the ability to, pressure other people into things they're not comfortable with. This
Mhm.
is very much where you see the, "Oh, you're not sleeping with me. Are you X-phobic?" Which
Yes,
you
yeah.
often see, the trans community pulling, for example. And that's a form of privilege. You're basically saying, well, my class outranks your class. And to deny me what I am asking you to is a offense to someone within my class. Like you saying no to me is not something that's allowed.
Yeah.
And so I think that having a mental illness in an ironic way within our current context is a privilege. Fortunately, we seem to only create autistic children. So far, all of them that have been old enough to be diagnosed have been diagnosed with autism. So that that maybe we're breeding true. For people who don't know what breeding true means, it's when two dogs of the same breed are having children. But I've never been diagnosed with autism, and I don't think I have many autism symptoms or
No.
yeah.
No.
S So and I, by the way, have reached out to the people who did this. If anyone here knows anyone in this group, they're called the skeptic.com, and they ran a 2024 presidential election study, which is where this data came from. And I
Interesting.
really wanna split this data further. I wanna split it along political lines. I wanna split it along religious affiliation. I wanna split it along whether someone's a parent, because 'cause I'd be very interested to see, where this is coming from. But I also want to point out that there also has been a huge explosion in mental health diagnoses recently. So from 2012 to 2018, there was a 34.6% increase in the prevalence of mental illness diagnosis in the United States. Um, in 2021, 22.8% of US adults experienced a mental illness. Now, this is where this gets really interesting. In 2021, 22.8% of adults are listed as having a mental illness. Yet, even in these lower demographics, 47, so this is in Gen X, 47% of men are identifying with a mental illness strongly, and 53% of women are. Or in
Yeah.
millennials, 56% of males are, and 67% of females are. So
Well, and that's
much
pervasively
larger.
discussed online. Most of the people who are talking about having a mental condition of some sort or special mental status are self-diagnosed.
Mhm.
Even people who really heavily talk about it. I remember at one point on Red Scare, Anna and Dasha had a guy, there was an entire episode on autism, and it
Mhm.
turns out this guy is completely self-diagnosed. Um, so
Autism LARPing. Autism as a class.
I mean,
Um,
maybe he was really autistic, who knows, right? But it's one of those things where a lot of people who are extra vociferous about it also seem to be self-diagnosed. I don't I it's a double-edged sword because on one hand, it's incredibly expensive to be diagnosed for things.
how expensive? Does the state not cover this? Like, how much do
No,
we
the
pay per
state
kid?
doesn't cover this. It doesn't cover this for our children. So unless we were on completely state-supported health insurance or healthcare,
How much per kid? You're just giving vague
around
numbers.
$500 per kid.
That is that is not a lot of money these days. With
It is to me.
inflation, $500 per child?
500 who is $500?
Simone, for a class status, $500, even for somebody without a ton of money, is not this keep in mind, you're not talking about like this is something you need to have done every year or every month. This is something you need to have done once in your life. $500, I'm sorry, I don't buy that. That is
You don't think
not
that that's expensive? I think it's expensive. I
that
think
is
for
that
most
is not
people
gating people out of this for economic
there are
reasons.
also, in some cases, up to 6-month waits. Now, I think after the pandemic ceased, this has become a lot easier. It's, for example, it was easier for us to book an appointment for our second son to be evaluated than for our first son. So I do think that it is easier to get a diagnosis now than it was before. But most people are still just not bothering, and they're choosing, perhaps because they're worried that they wouldn't receive a professional
I'm gonna
diagnosis,
push back.
choosing
I
to get
don't
a
think these
diagnosis
numbers are
now.
real. These numbers just aren't real. It's not that these are people who are going undiagnosed because they don't have the money. There is no way 72% of women in Gen Z have a mental health condition.
Well,
And
and
if they
but again, I guess I could push back and say the DSM really isn't about like, "Oh, do you have something that's broken?" It's more about behaviors that deviate from societal norms, and maybe we are seeing a surge of behaviors that deviate from
now
societal norms.
this is interesting. And I actually think that this is part of what's going on here is that people are saying, in what ways am I different from what I think society expects of me?
Mm.
And then they're defining that, the things about them that are different from societal expectations,
Oh, as being the thing that makes
as
them them.
as a mental illness, but it's also just to, previous generations, it's just this is how I'm unique, right?
Mhm.
But to them, how they're unique needs to be medicalized because through medicalizing it, it is given tangibility.
Yeah, so
Um,
clinically depressed is the new emo. You used to
yeah,
just
you
be
can't
goth or
say
emo, and
I'm
now you're just
emo.
depressed.
It's I'm depressed, but I'm depressed like as an aesthetic because I think they mean something more than what it meant historically. Historically, it would be like, okay, this might color like some of your choices. I think now a lot of these mental illnesses are associated with fashion, with music choices, with it is a subculture. And let's talk about why this is desperately unhealthy. First of all, when you medicalize the ways that you are different from mainstream society, you remove personal responsibility from them and you
Mm.
remove your ability to modulate them or choose among them. And I think that this is actually really critical because, I can, for example, be like, hey, I am an incredibly confident person, for example. But
Right.
being an incredibly confident person can lead me to sometimes doing things which inconvenience other people or cause damage in social situations. Now, if I've medicalized my confidence, I get to now say, well, I don't need to address the negative externalities of this personality feature
Mhm.
because it's a medical condition and therefore no one can say don't do it.
Yeah, if anything, you should accommodate it. You as
Yeah.
in the average person around you.
But also in the way that we relate to our own challenges in life. So you look at something like anxiety, and let's see, 43% of adults say they feel more anxious than the previous year in 2024. This is up from 37% in 2023 and 32% in 2022. So, like, look at something like anxiety, right?
Yeah.
If I say that I, as a personality, have anxiety sometimes, and I categorize anxiety as something that I don't want and that isn't effective in my daily life, I would just work on ways to be less anxious. If
Yeah.
I have an anxiety disorder, now the anxiety is, and as I said, an important part of who they are. To
Mm,
remove the anxiety is to genocide this community in their minds, to genocide the community of the anxious,
that's
of the
interesting.
medically anxious.
Yeah, well, actually, this is something that I felt when I was first diagnosed with OCD and then told that I could medicate it. I was really against the idea because I didn't want to remove what I considered to be part of myself. Like, if I didn't have the things I did that were categorized as OCD by clinicians, I felt like I wouldn't be me. And I mean, I think, you could probably actually agree with the fact that if I suddenly stopped doing all the things that we now know are associated with my autism, I would be a very different person.
Would you?
Yeah.
I
Think
mean,
about it.
you
Think about
would.
it.
I guess I would say that I would be dramatically more worried about you as a wife. I mean, one of the good things about your situation is that there really is no risk of you ever cheating on me or even having a desire to cheat on me because she doesn't like when people touch her other than me and our
Or
kids.
ever getting fat
Or
because
ever
I
getting
weigh
fat.
and
Oh, that's
measure
a
all
big
of my
one,
food
yeah.
or
I
whatever.
have a, and I've mentioned this on other podcasts, but it is, I think, one of my greatest personality flaws, which is an instinctual, really high level of disgust towards fat people.
Well, I'm also unlikely to ever get unfit because my manifestation, my autistic manifestation of stimming has apparently always been some form of exercise. And when I was a teen, it was just constantly swimming and not stopping. And now it's just constantly walking and not stopping, which is why I have my treadmill desk. So again, like this is if suddenly all of these things disappeared, I would become a very different person. So I don't know if these people are wrong in equating elements of, but I mean, I also see the other side. So let's say that you choose to identify with your anxiety. I mean, the problem is the it seems practically speaking, the best way to deal with your anxiety is you just learn to care about something else a little bit more and face the thing that makes you anxious. And as you get used to it, you'll discover it's not so bad. And if you instead act as though your anxiety is something that just like is a signal that has to be listened to in the form of, oh, don't do this, therefore, then the anxiety will only get worse and your circle of life will become smaller and smaller until literally you're choked out of existence. And I know this because I have dealt with anxiety in both ways. And right now we're in the, oh, you're anxious about this thing? Let's do way more of it. Turn the volume up to 11. Whereas before it used to be, oh, I just won't do this thing.
Well, and
And
I've noticed with your own, mental proclivities that they have significantly decreased as your responsibilities have increased.
yeah.
The pull this stuff has on you is intrinsically higher when you are in environments that are more privileged, which is,
Mhm.
I think, and a lot of these people don't realize how privileged their environments are because they don't realize how little real work they do. Because I just don't think that they know how much people who work hard actually work. I think that's one of
Mhm.
the big things in society these days is, well, for example, like you and I was thinking how blessed I was earlier today that we get to eat a meal every day, and other people would be like, "A meal every day? Surely you have more than 1 meal a day," and it's like, not even from a diet perspective, like, who has the time to have 2 meals in a day, let alone 3? Or, when I wake up at 2 a.m. to 1 a.m. every morning, and people are like, "Oh, well, you must take long." I take like 30-minute naps to an hour nap sometimes during the day, but not even every day. And I feel like I have to do all this stuff. And I'm also really strict with Simone about any sort of indulgent activity, whether that is cleaning. And people are like, "Wait, cleaning you see as an indulgent activity?" I'm like, "Yes, cleaning is an indulgent activity. It can always be done faster, it can be batched, and it's not necessary all the time." And I think that a lot of these people who are dealing with these issues just have so much genuine, when I say free time, I don't mean totally free time, but like your brain finds ways to occupy the tasks that are allotted to you. And as you take on more tasks, your schedule, I think, naturally finds a way to accommodate them. And the thing that is most pushed out is the mental discomfort and second guessing and anxiety and stuff like that. Would you
Yeah,
agree?
or you
Or
could think of your life as a vase and the the anxiety that you have or all of your worry as sand. And if you just fill your vase with really large rocks first, like much bigger things and more important things to care about, there's less room to put sand in. And if you just like throw in one or two rocks, your vase is full of sand. Like if you just crowd it out, it seems to make a big difference.
Well, and I think that I mean, so for people also keep in mind, we have 4 kids right now, so we're at this stage where kids just don't give you a lot of time to indulge in these emotional states. And I think also as a parent, you likely undergo some biological changes which lower things like anxiety and stuff like that. I don't know. I've seen some parents who are really anxious, but they usually have like 1 or 2 kids. I don't know if I've ever seen a parent with a ton of kids be super anxious or like helicopter.
Agreed. Yeah, most of the parents that I know who have a lot of kids seem relaxed. If anything negative, it's just exhausted, but
Yeah.
not even mad because they're just too tired to be mad.
Yeah, they're also less judgy as people. This is another thing I've noticed. They're very
Yeah.
much less judgy of other people, the ones I know. Like other people that it might be because they're like intrinsically they understand like the high school social game just doesn't matter to them anymore. Like once you get to like 5 kids or whatever, or 4 kids.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it's because also you have this huge social network within your own house and there's enough politics to kind of keep you occupied there. But yeah. But okay, so going back to identifying with your mental illness, I do agree that when you choose to identify with it rather than see it as just, "Ah, here's this thing that maybe I have to deal with," it can cause you to not attempt to overcome it with the rigor you otherwise would, right? That's the issue?
Well, yeah, and I think that we choose what our primary identity is. And I think that anything that you are born with, choosing that as your primary identity, identifying with something that you didn't choose, I think is always intrinsically toxic. So whether it is an identity that you have gotten because you think, oh, well, I have these personality characteristics which are associated with this mental illness in my mind, or I am white and therefore being white is a core part of my identity, I think is really not because these things fundamentally aren't really who you are. Who you are the things you chose to believe. And for that reason, I think that the core identity that people should be choosing in terms of like who they are is threefold. I would
Okay.
say one is what you believe about the world. I think that's a really important category of identity. This can be religion, or it can be a set of philosophical beliefs, or it can be a way of ordering your thoughts. I think having that as a core mechanism of identity is meaningful because it's what you chose, right? So it is really you, uh, unless you didn't choose it. And some people are just sort of born into a tradition and don't really take any ownership of it. And in that case, maybe I think it makes sense to make it. The other thing I'd say is your cultural ancestry or a chosen cultural ancestry being
Mm.
part of your identity. I've seen people who choose some degree of cultural ancestry. And note, this isn't necessarily an ethnic ancestry. So, for example, when people look at my cultural ancestry and I am choosing a cultural identity, they will note in terms of the naming of my kids or myself, I do a lot of Roman stuff, Roman and Greek, classical Greek and Rome. And this is not who I am. I am not Greek or Roman, but I identify with those cultures because I want to continue to build on the greatness that they achieved. And so it's sort of like, what Lego set am I playing with? Am I continuing to build upon? I'm choosing that as an aspect of the way I see myself. And the final one I would say is with your family. And people can be like, well, why is that so important? I think that, and this is my core identity, is as a member of like, I don't really see myself as a different independent entity than you anymore, or the kids. I am sort of like one part of a pie chart, I guess you'd say, in terms of
Mm.
my identity. And I think that kids really struggle with this when they're younger, because they have this instinct to rebel and create their own new pie chart. And it can cause them to undervalue what they can draw from their parents and grandparents and great grandparents what they went through. Yet I think as a young person, seeing yourself as an intergenerational entity is also very mentally healthy. And a lot of people are like, oh no, how could you say that? Putting so much. And I'm like, not really. I mean, it's just true, one, and then two, it explains things about yourself. I think one of the most important things that I learned from seeing myself as an intergenerational entity is it makes it easier to look at things that your parents do that through different eyes you don't want to repeat. And you're like, ah, I must have that tendency in me as well. How do I circumvent it?
Hmm.
What are your thoughts on this?
I still defer to the form of self identity creation that we outline in the Pragmatist Guide to Life, where we basically say choose your objective function. That is to say, choose that thing or that collection of things that you wish to maximize with your existence. Then set out your ideology, which is a series of hypotheses on how you think you can maximize that thing or those things. And then three, based on what you've been dealt, that is to say, your body, your circumstances, your appearance, your intelligence, your connections, whatever it may be, using those tools and those materials, craft an identity that will maximize your objective function per your ideology. And that seems to me the most practical,
I think
clear
you're right.
thing to
Yeah.
do.
I'll hold to that. I'll hold
That
to that.
doesn't have to do with and of course, for us, seeing ourselves as part of an unbroken family chain certainly plays into that objective function and also the way we see the world, because our ideology is one of techno-Puritanism, of future worship, of long-termism and pronatalism. So yeah, it makes sense for you to do that, but I don't know if it makes sense for everyone to do that. It depends on everyone's unique set of
I
objective
guess
functions
this
and
is where I've
ideology.
changed since writing the Pragmatist Guide to Life,
Mm.
is that I think that having more structure that somebody else just gives you is important for a large part of the population. People like you and me, we are capable of rethinking everything from scratch with every possible challenge that we come across. I don't think that the average human has the capacity to do this effectively. And I think that it reminds me of the Pragmatist Guide to Life, where people go through it and they come to like the dumbest objective function, which is general utilitarianism. And I'm like, oh, that's the obviously wrong choice. But they're like, this is what the book is arguing for, right? And it's like, if you give somebody too many choices, if you force them to think through too many things, they default to the societal norm. And for that reason, I think it is useful to lay out, yeah, but at the end of the day, these identities are probably going to be best for achieving what you want to achieve. Do
Yeah,
you agree or
I somewhat agree.
I mean,
I
I
do
think this
think some well, I mean, so I would say if you're part of a culture or religion that gives you preset templates that are already aligned with your objective function and that already match with what you've been dealt. For example, if you are Mormon, you're given an objective function or a series of objective functions. You're given ideologies, and based on who you are, for example, a man or a woman, you're given a clear identity to which you are kind of expected to conform. So you know who to be and you know what to identify with, and none of those things as it
Well,
happens.
that's why I'm saying, like, as we build a system for our kids, I
Mhm.
don't think the right thing is to tell our kids, you need to figure all this out on your own, your identity, everything like that, to maximize your objective function. I think giving them frameworks before that is going to be more effective, and then allowing them to modify those frameworks to create the optimal one for their objective function.
It depends. For those kids of ours who really opt in to and really like our family culture, absolutely we'll be like, well, this is the way you can go with our family culture. But for those who want to explore their own thing, I think we should give them the tool set to do that adequately instead of just encouraging them to randomly
No,
glom
I think
on to other
I think that
toxic
makes
things.
sense. And I think having a great deal of family shame for capitulating to the urban monoculture value set in these forms of identity is really important to protecting and warding them and warding our children against them being placed on them. What I wanted to get to here was something that I think humans have an addictive tendency towards doing this, or like a really strong mental tendency towards doing this. And we write about it in some of our books and we mention it on some of our podcasts, but I cannot help but restate it, is that people want to be told who they are. This is just something you see over and over and over again,
Yeah,
especially
horoscopes, blood types,
blood types, by the
Myers-Briggs
way, is an East
profiles.
Asian thing.
Mhm.
Sorry, you were saying what was the next one?
Myers-Briggs profiles,
Oh, yeah,
etc.
Myers-Briggs profiles. So, zodiac signs, and these are always more common among women. Women seem to have an intrinsic desire to be told what their identity is, and some men do as well, but it's just obviously stronger in the data we presented here, and in, if you know zodiac sign people, they're usually women. If you know blood type people, they're usually women. If you know Myers-Briggs profile people, maybe a few more autistic men, but women in the EA community seem to care a lot more about it than men do. Men mostly use it for dating purposes. But why is this the case? I don't know. I suspect it's something that's sort of wrong with maybe our mental coding. Is a We expect society to tell us who we are and what our roles are. And when society doesn't, when society says choose anything, you do a Sex in the City quiz and you're a Samantha and that's who you are for the rest of your life. You choose to, and I think that this is actually, when you look at books that do well, like the Harry Potter books, I think they explicitly do well because they presented a framework like this, like the house selection process and everything like that. There
Mm.
is an escapist fantasy to be told and categorized by who you are. I mean, this is something you keep seeing in girl teen dystopias that are targeted at women primarily. Are you a X or are you a Y? And that's how we know. When you were a kid, Simone, did you ever fantasize about like being told who you were, or any of these worlds where they give you an identity?
Probably, but I don't have any distinct memories of it, and I imagine you never did because you're just so strong about who you want,
No,
like
even I find these concepts alluring. I
really?
I would kind of, especially as a teen, if I could be told you're an X house, like you're a Slytherin, now have pride in being a Slytherin, I would love that. And I think that, okay, new hypothesis forming here.
Okay.
I think what we're seeing here is because we have erased people's pride in their family and in their own cultural history,
Yeah, they wanna have
people
pride
can't
in something.
say, I'm a Scotch Irish, Greater Appalachian cultural group. I'm a,
Scots
you know,
Irish.
what?
Scots, not
Yes, I said,
Scotch.
oh, whatever. That they don't have anything to have pride in or any cultural group to identify in, when historically you would have. If you were growing up in Manhattan, you would have been like, oh, they're the X group and they're the Y group and they're the Z group. Or if you were growing up in rural Scotland, it would have been like, well, that's X clan and that's Y clan and that's Z clan and they're like this and they're like this and they're like this. And I think that when we took that away from people, they needed to create new clan identities. And this is part of what we're seeing here, because at the end of the day, while there are some cultures that are truly individualist, I think the clan cultures have always been sort of a bit more common. And when you take away the right to identify with your family and cultural group, you sort of force the need to identify with something new and have pride in it and have immediate kinship with people within it.
And you've made this argument, for example, about Q groups as well, that it's like the last group of if you wanna have some form of white pride, you just choose to identify
Yeah,
as
we can watch our video "Laundering of White Pride," but,
yeah.
like, I'm like, they took the white pride parades and they dropped the word white, but they have changed nothing else. This is not, as much as they will pretend like this culture is downstream of, like, native culture or something, it is not. It is a purely derivative of European cultural groups, and they are celebrating European cultural conquest of native individuals or recent immigrants when they make these celebrations. Any final thoughts, Simone? People really love it when you say things because you're the smart one. How are you going to keep our kids from identifying as autistic?
I I am not against the idea of identifying with a mental illness when you identify with that mental illness in a way where you like lean into it into a strength. So I think that mental illness identification is a double-edged sword, and I am all for unholstering your autism as long as you use it as a deadly weapon for good. I think
Mm.
most people unholster their autism or whatever, and they shoot themselves in the head. If you just instead do something meaningful with it, that's amazing. And I think that there are plenty of fictional characters even that show autistic people using their autism in a way that bestows them with superpowers.
Like Monk. Monk's a great
Sure.
example of this,
Like
actually.
Monk, like Lisbeth Salander from the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo series. She's highly autistic and definitely like a superpowered female. So I don't think that these things have to be toxic. And that's why I feel very conflicted about this.
I think that they are. If it's not something you chose, don't identify with it. Identify with maybe an iteration of it, but always keep it positive. When you identify with something that's a cage, you are building a cage around yourself.
Well, sure. And it's hard for me to think of scenarios, for example, in which people identified with their anxiety and it went well for them, for example. So I understand that. But I think you have to think about these things tactically and go back to our whole argument about constructing a strong identity. It has to have very good virtues and very good vices. And you cannot have a complete public identity without very clear vices. And sometimes a vice is a mental illness. And that's okay. I think it's okay to have, and you need to have vices or you're not believable. You're not seen as consistent. You're not seen as trustworthy if people don't know immediately and clearly what is wrong with you. So
I
I don't
agree
feel as
with
confident
that.
about it as
Yeah,
you do.
okay. I'll agree with that.
What was the Churchill line? He has all of the virtues I detest and none of the vices I love, something like that. I'm a
No.
big vice person. I love a good vice on someone. A potty mouth, a weird disorder, a tick, weird over judgmental behavior, over the top behavior. I Vices are the new virtue, but only if they're managed in a way that is not genuinely disruptive or annoying. So it's this is a dangerous road to travel.
Mm. Well, I love you to death, Simone. You are a very special woman.
Yeah. I love you.
I
Thanks.
love you too. No, so Stable Diffusion is one of these models where I'm actually running it locally on my computer.
Oh, wow.
Um,
Okay, I didn't
and
know it did that.
and I can use lots of different like sub models that I can put on top of it. So I can use it to create much less filtered images, i.e., like because that's a huge problem whenever we're creating title cards because we do spicy topics, and they're always like, "Oh, Microsoft, oh, you're disparaging someone, or this looks naughty or violent," and that gets me into trouble. But with Stable Diffusion, because a lot of people use it for not safe for work content,
Oh, they
um,
do?
yeah, because it's done locally on my GPU.
Oh, I see. So they're not afraid of being sued or something because of their
Yeah, so you can get looser
naughty.
models and then models that are trained on different things. Anyway, so it gives me a good opportunity to expand the types of title cards that we're putting together. And by the way, for anyone who wonders what I use for title cards, typically if it's a cartoony one, I'm using Microsoft Studio, which is one of the best for that.
Oh, not the
Uh,
DeviantArt one?
the DeviantArt one does the more artsy styles or more stylized things.
Hmm.
It actually turns out that, however, for the 1950s atomic style, with like the housewives and stuff, Microsoft Studio is best for that.
Oh, I bet.
Um,
Yeah, DeviantArt can't really do it. Black Forest can't really do it. So,
Black
yeah,
Forest I use for a lot of stuff whenever I'm doing something realistic, but it's not really
realistic
good
is
at
great.
anything non-realistic. Like it
Y
can't take a concept and make something.
Yeah.
But Microsoft is very good at that. But we'll see if I can bring Stable Diffusion into my repertoire because it should also because I can load different models that sort of change its presumptive training structure. It's gonna give me more precision in terms of the types of images I'm creating, and I eventually want to get to a point where I can even do training myself.
Ooh.
Because I would really like to train a model, and if any of our fans know how to do this and can do it for me, on 1950s atomic style images.
Yes.
Like
Like old
advertisements from the
ads.
1950s of like
Yes.
housewives, house husbands,
Yes,
stuff
yes,
like that.
yes, yes, yes.
I think that I could create a really interesting one, and I'd prefer to just go with that style for all our images if I could.
Just always, always. I don't know,
Just
sometimes
always housewives. Yes.
always no, always 1950s atomic optimism.
Well, I like their future optimism in that time period.
Yeah,
It's
technofuturism, or no, what it was, retrofuturism, that's the term. Do you remember the old blog Retrofuturism? Did you ever follow it? It was a great old, like from, we'll say 2009, 2008. I don't know
oh yes, I
if you
liked
remember.
that.
Yeah. Okay, you were
That
there
was a
too.
nice old blog. I remember the age of blogs, by the way, Simone.
Yeah.
Where you had God, what was the one that I loved so much, and it's so woke now. I can't even remember. I used to
Remember
watch
when
all
I Can Has Cheeseburger was a thing?
the
Back in
guy
the
who
day.
founded I Can't Has Cheeseburger, by the way, deep
Eric
lore
Nakagawa, yeah.
and Simone was an advisor in our first startup, Art Corgi, and we met with him a lot, and he's a really cool guy.
Oh, yeah, we've since, or at least I saw him at ETH Denver, because now he works in, or at least when I saw him at ETH Denver like 2 years ago, he worked in crypto. I think he still
Oh,
does. Yeah,
that's wild. Hold
from
on, I'm
memes
trying to.
to meme coins, I guess. Makes sense.
And by the way, I decided to look up to see if they had 1950s style creators, and they do.
Mm.
So I might be able to see if I can get one of these to work well. That would be really exciting.
Start your engines, Malcolm.
Well, if I can make better title cards, more thematic title cards, more iconic title cards, I am going to be very, very excited.